Welcome to the Storytelling with Data podcast, where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Cole.
Hello, and thanks for tuning in. I am extremely excited today to be joined by Nathan Yau. I first came to know Nathan's work through his blog and website, FlowingData, where he's been posting, I believe, daily, we'll confirm that, since 2007. And I'll do the math for you. That is 17 years. And it was certainly one of the first. And actually, as I think back, it may have even been the first blog that I started following way back when. Nathan has a PhD in statistics from UCLA and is author of Data Points, as well as the freshly released second edition of his popular first book, Visualize This, which we will dig into today. Nathan, welcome to the Storytelling with Data podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been following you since you started quite a while ago, too, so it's nice to be on.
Yay, it's crazy. We've been, maybe playing in the same playground for quite some time, but this is the first chance to actually see and talk to you live, which is super fun.
I remember when you first got started, it was like at the very beginning, and so it's been fun to watch storytelling with data kind of grow from where it has been, where it was from.
Same for me with your stuff. And I'd love to start with your story. So I imagine, like me, that a lot of people listening are familiar with your work. They've read articles at FlowingData, seen some of your award-winning visualizations, or read your books. But I want to back up before that. I'm curious, when did you first, or can you remember when you first became interested in data and in visualizing data, and take us on the path from then to now?
Yeah, so updating this new book has forced me to go way back to the beginning of when I was learning visualization. I went to grad school for statistics, and I was using visualization in a very basic way, mostly to look at my data really fast, get a summary of the statistics. And I would make a few things for reports and mostly just like throwaway analytical charts. And then I was taking a course during my first year of grad school, and my future advisor came to give a guest lecture, and it was about visualization, but it was not about charts. It was from the data art perspective, because he taught with the design media arts department at UCLA. And so every single thing was this representation of data that I had never seen before. And that was really what got me interested in visualization. So like that day, I searched for data visualization to see what other examples there was. And I found this site called Information Aesthetics by Andrew Vandemore, which is unfortunately not around anymore, but it's about projects in the same spirit as what my advisor had just talked about. And it was mostly about I would describe it as feeling data and not so much analyzing data and trying to optimize things. It was about experiencing data around us, and it's sort of like we're producing it, people are collecting it about us, and we should understand it in some way. And so from there, it kind of grew, and then my advisor became my advisor, and I started working on a lot of different other projects. And FlowingData came a little later, but I would say it stems from that.
And then FlowingData, can you talk a little bit about the inception of it? What made you decide to start a blog way back when blogs weren't a common thing in 2007?
It was kind of by accident, because I was going back to school. I was taking a class on statistical computing, and then again, it was with my advisor, Mark Hansen. And so his approach was to throw as many tools as possible at us and to say, here's what you can use. And then at the end of the course, we have a class project, and you're going to use everything that you've learned in this course for that class project. And the whole grade and whatnot is based on this project. And so I used a lot of Unix, Google Maps, and then there was R, Python, like a very big mix of things. And I was just getting into sort of like web things, and I wanted to make a web project. So I had to pay for hosting, and with that hosting, for $4.99 per month came a free domain, which happened to be FlowingData.com. And so I held on to that for a little while, doing nothing with it. It was just placeholders for class projects. So I start getting more into web things with class projects. And then my wife, she had to do her she's a ER physician. She had to do her medical residency in Buffalo, New York, and we were in Los Angeles. So I moved to Buffalo, and then I was really isolated. So I needed a way to
project, right?
talk about it. Yeah. So I started FlowingData as a way to catalog things. Yeah. And it was basically a way for me to learn about visualization, learn about charts. And if you go back to the very beginning, the very early archives, it's definitely me trying to figure things out. What visualization, what is this? I like this. And I would talk to my classmates and send things to my classmates. And then that's how it started. And then it grew from there and started learning more, started making things. And then it's kind of morphed into what it is now, but it's very much about still learning about it and talking about it and then trying to grow it from there.
But talking about it as a way of solidifying the learning and then maybe bringing in other perspectives as well. So I don't know about you, but the early days of blogging, and you talk about feeling isolated in Buffalo, but there used to be a lot of conversations happening in that space, right? Where you post something and you get a bunch of comments and you get to know people that way, right? Well before the social media stuff that exists now was even around.
Yeah, I would go to information aesthetics and comment. There was Robert Coursera's Eager Eyes, which is kind of still around, and there's a comment section there, and FlowingData had a comment section. It had pretty good discussions at the beginning, and then there was a time when social media took over, discussions on blogs became very weird, and it just had to transform to other places.
Yeah. Okay, let's transition into talking about your book. I've talked about this a little bit already, but your work has definitely been influential for me. I was getting interested in the visual design of graphs right around the same time that you started blogging at FlowingData. But I think even more impactful for me than your site were your books. So I'm going to share a quick story. As if we rewind to, I don't know, let's say 2013 was when I was thinking about writing in a more serious way. And I remember distinctly at one point walking over to my bookshelf and scanning through the books. And what I was looking for was trying to figure out what publisher might be a good fit. And there were not a lot of books in this space at that point in time. And the ones that did exist, I'm thinking of books by Tufte, Stephen Few, Colin Ware, they were much more textbook-like. And I remember pulling a couple of non-textbooky books off the shelf, different form factor, soft cover, smaller dimensions, and books about visualizing data that you could sit down and read and that were actually enjoyable to read. And yours was one of those books. One was Visualize This. The other was Alberto Cairo's The Functional Art. Right? These books just looked and felt and sounded so much different than anything else that existed at that point in time or that I knew about at that point in time. And I just remember thinking, this is the sort of book I want to write. And both of them are published by Wiley, which is actually one of the main reasons that I went that route with my books.
Wow. Yeah. At the time, there was a limited resources back then. And that was also right before the book. I had to learn tools for an internship. And then so I didn't know how to use them. I read the books that you mentioned. And then when I had to make the charts, there was a big disconnect between the tools that I had to use and what I knew, and I couldn't implement what I had just learned and apply it to what I did. So Visualize This kind of stems from that, I would say.
Yeah, and solves that problem. So the official publication was just a few days ago, though I think there were some copies in circulation before that. So first I want to say congratulations.
Thanks.
Awesome to have a new, refreshed version out there. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to write a second edition and why now? What can readers expect?
Yeah, so I mean, because the first one, there are a lot of concrete examples that use tools that I used and that people used in 2010, 2011. And it is a reflection of the process of visualizing data, of how I did it in 2010, 2011. And I was still in school. And so I wrote the book and it did well. And I think it helped people. But I've been making charts and analyzing data for like 14 more years. And so my process has changed. The foundations are similar, but the tools are very different. And my process is much more refined. And I've also learned how to write more. It was my first book, and I had never written anything over like 20 pages. So the book was just, I don't know. I like, sure, I'll do it. So the new book is new tools, refined process. And I would say it leans a lot more into the analysis side of visualization, because a lot of visualization books are about like the design side and making the charts and what chart to do. But the part that's right before that is also really important, is figuring out like what the data is about and what you should chart, how you should chart it, and why you should do it. So if you like figure all that out, the next part is much easier. So I tried to hit on that a lot more.
Yeah, and the part you describe is the hardest for a lot of people as well. So I definitely want to dig into that and your process a bit more. All of the examples are new.
Mm-hmm. Every example is based on the charts that I've made for FlowingData or for work that I've done over the past decade.
We'll talk about some of those examples. First, I want to give folks a sense of the structure of the book. So a bulk of the chapters are organized around a specific aspect to visualize: time, categories, relationships, space, and your approach within each of these is consistent. Can you share with readers what they'll find in these sections?
Yeah, I guess it goes back to understanding the data. So the format of the book and the flow has to do with my own flow of getting a data set and taking that raw data set all the way to a finished graphic that I can publish. And so it starts with the data collection side and then formatting. People in data always joke about like we spend all of our time formatting the data, but then on the visualization side, I guess we kind of miss that part. So, I mean, you still need that part. So I take it to that, and then ask about what type of data you have. So it's visualizing time, visualizing categories, and what you want to know about the data. And it's all driven by the questions behind what you have. So like you have to have kind of this curiosity about what the data is about, or you want to know something specific about the data. And you take that question, you try to answer it, and that'll kind of drive what you need to do with the data, instead of saying, here's a data set, here's a chart, now that's all I got.
Now what? Yeah. And within the chapters on the different types of, time, categories, relationships, space, you share code that people can copy and work through to create a lot of those visualizations as well. I think this goes back to the gap you were referring to in some of the maybe classic literature that was out there when you wrote the first edition.
Again, I think especially for beginners, when they don't know how to make anything and they're coming to it fresh. So you have a data set and you're trying to learn about it. You need like a concrete example of, okay, I know I want to make this type of chart and I want to figure out this type of data, but now what? Then you have to like go sleuthing the internet for like random examples, and examples that might not be that good or might be sketchy, or like someone is just doing what they know at the time. So I'd say with each example, I followed up with a concrete example of code or software and go through step by step on how to do it. And so you want to be able to make the exact thing that I just showed you that I liked.
And then you show visuals along the way of what output people should expect by modifying different pieces of the code or adding different things, different functionality, which is a neat way to guide people to learn that piece in, you're right, a much less intimidating way than just sending them out to the wild.
I really want people to go through the examples and then see in the book on their screen. So I want it to match as closely as possible, because it's going to be different with different computers, but to be able to follow the steps and see how like there are always blips along the way. There are like weird, just like, like menus are different, or like a tool looks different, or you make a mistake, you can go back and kind of see, like, it's easier to go back. My son likes Lego, so if like I show him like the very beginning part and then show the end part, and it's like, okay, go do, like, I'm not going to show you any of the in between.
Yeah,
Just
figure it out.
make this thing. There's all the pieces, so
Yeah.
every single piece to make, that spaceship is there. But I'm not going to tell you how to do it. But so if you have like every single step, it's a lot easier to do.
Yes. One of the things that struck me as I was reading through the new edition is, in addition to learning about different types of graphs and being able to see and work through the code, the mechanics, let's say, I think equally, if not more valuable, is the insight that you provide along the way into the process that you use when you are exploring data. And you talk a lot about the value of questions and using an iterative way of asking questions to make the visualization, and then use that to ask more questions, and then make more visualizations and analyze and visualize further. Can you talk more about this and what tactics you can share for those who are wanting to be robust but also efficient in the way that they analyze data?
I would say that over the years, people ask questions about like how I work and how I just keep going with it and where the ideas come from and whatnot. And a lot of people will have a data set and they'll just have the question, how should I visualize this? And there are, thousands of ways to visualize a single data set. And so you want to filter it down just into something that's manageable and something that will highlight what you want to show. But if you don't learn about the data, then you don't know what to show. And so the way to learn about the data is to ask questions. And that's, for me, I try to ask as many questions as I can about the data. So like with everything that I do on FlowingData, it sort of happens in like sets. And I'll look at a data set, say like time use, and I'll focus on a certain demographic. And then the next one would be a generalization of more demographics. And then like the next one would be like the demographics over time. So it goes back to like how I analyze, or how I learned to analyze data in school, and just going. Basically, John Tukey describes it as being a data detective, and you have an idea of what you have in front of you, and you want to learn about it and like think about it. And so you ask questions. You start with the very basic questions. I've described it as like getting to know someone on a first date. And so
I like that analogy.
You go with very broad questions first, like what are your interests, where are you from, how's the weather, things like that, and you get to know them. And once you get to know them, then that spurs on other questions. But you can't to get to the detailed questions if you don't know the general stuff first. So you go to the general stuff. A lot of people with data stop at the general stuff. But you want to get to know the person, get to know the data, ask more specific questions. And once you learn about that, it starts becoming more interesting. Or if it's not a match, then you end it, or you delete the data set. You go to the next one.
Exit, rewind.
Yeah. And so you ask questions, learn about it, ask more questions, get detailed, and then go from there. And then once you know it, then you can if we go with the person, with the date analogy, you marry that person, you know what they like, you can get them gifts, you can get gifts that they're interested in, things that are useful to them, or things that they would love. With the data set, you learn about it, you know what the data is about. You can make the charts that help the data communicate to as other people. Instead of forcing the data to, let the data speak, you help translate the data for an audience. And the only way you get there is by asking and learning about the data.
And you then open up the possibility of finding more interesting questions and thus more interesting answers than if you stay at that general level as well. Right? You have to start there to maybe do some aggregation and understand where to go deeper. But if you stop too soon, you never get to the interesting bits, which I want to talk a little bit more about in a moment. Before that, though, one of the recommendations that you have that comes up across the book in a number of places in different ways is this idea that people should stay skeptical when they're working with data. At one point, you talk about a process that's verify, explore, communicate. So I'm curious, where have you seen things go wrong, and how can people avoid these missteps?
All data has its issues. It starts at the very beginning when there's a person or someone who programmed a machine to collect data, and that could be biased. There could be a blip in the measurement device. Someone could have made a typo. And there's just so many little things that could just completely throw you off. And so like even in statistics, we're often taking raw data and we're trying to estimate things and we're measuring them. But if you do that over a long period of time, then it's going to change. Like the estimation process is going to change. The collection process could change. And so I look at census data a lot, or I look at government data a lot that stretches over decades. And so if you like plot something over time, it could look like something has changed dramatically. But actually, in reality, nothing has changed or has changed very little. But the estimation process changed. I'm looking at income data right now over time for different occupations. And in 2010, it looks like statisticians, based on how I measured it, it looked like it suddenly dropped off to zero income in 2010. But it's actually just, they stopped using statistician as a job classification.
Yeah. Turned into data
And then
scientist
it got crunched into miscellaneous mathematical sciences. And so
That
just stuff
doesn't
like
sound
that,
quite
it's
right.
like so like really little.
Yeah.
But if you're going to wrap an entire story around this weird blip in the data, you better
Yeah.
make sure it's right. And
Yes.
like people are going to make, I would say the main thing is that people are going to make decisions based on that chart. So you really want to make sure that the data and the chart that you make are accurate. And so if something seems really surprising, a lot of the time it's because something is wrong with the data. And so you want to really make sure it is surprising. And if it is surprising, then that's pretty cool. But a lot of the time it's a weird blip in the data collection process.
Yeah. I mentioned this phrase earlier, but there was a sentence that caught my attention and made me smile as I was reading. I think it was in the context of analyzing data, where you said, look for the interesting bits, which is so simple and yet can be elusive for a lot of people as they're analyzing data and looking at graphs. I think especially people who might be newer to that. Have you found, are there common places where these interesting bits tend to hide?
Well, for me, it's very much about looking at the highest granularity data set that I can find. And so with like census data, you can pull up aggregates, you can pull up mean, median, mode, and quartiles and quantiles. But you can also download microdata, which is the individual survey responses. Okay. And so I look for, I guess a lot of people might refer to it as noise, but a lot of the time the noise is a better reflection of, the reality. And so I like to focus on that noisy bits and try to show as much noise as I can that still reveals the pattern. I think people like to aggregate because it makes the data easier to see and it makes it easier to analyze because
it feels simpler, right? Because you're working with fewer numbers at that point. But
you want to make a quick decision, get quick aggregates and look at it. And that works I think it works for a lot of things. But for me, I'm looking for like the most fun parts of the data, and that tends to be in the noise and tends to be in the outliers, things that might be thrown away in a traditional analysis or like a quick analysis to make overarching big decisions. But like even when someone makes a policy, and it's based on these like overarching aggregates, there's always a very large group of people who are like, what about us? We're not like included in this. So I go back to like relationships. I look at relationship data, and people talked about the first time they had sex, when they got married, when they had a boyfriend, girlfriend, they had a first kiss. And there was like this chart that shows the average age of all those things. And then there was like this huge, long comment thread of people saying, I guess I'm not normal. I guess I was early bloomer. I guess I was late. But, like only that little sliver is that small group of people. And then everyone else is going to be like on the other side. And so by including the distribution or as much of the population as you can, you get into like this much more interesting dynamic of what the data is about and what the population is about, or what it's really about seeing what the data actually represents instead of seeing what the middle of the population represents.
Well, and I forget if it was that example or a different one, but where when you show the distribution, it's actually really skewed. Like there's nobody, doing these things up until a certain point, and then a lot of people, and then a long tail. Yeah, which tells you very different things, or it would lead you to interpret it very differently than when you're looking at the single mean or median.
There are two projects that continue to be popular on FlowingData, and they're the most popular that anything that I've made. And they're both
Yeah.
simulations. One is how people spend a day in America, and the other one is how you will die. And they're both simulations, and they both show individual data points. The day in the life shows like 1,000 dots, and it shows 1,000 dots moving back and forth through a 24-hour period. So overall, you can see like the general trend of what people are doing, but you can also see like if you focus on one person, you can kind of see what they did during the day. And then how you will die is a more heavy subject, but we think about life expectancy a lot and sort of like this individual number of like, you're going to die at 78, but obviously that's not the same. It's not going to be the same for everyone.
Right.
So we can like cut the data in more detailed ways, and then see that, there's still a possibility that you could die within a year. And that like one dot, even though it's a single dot or a very small percentage, is still a possibility. And for me, it was like giving much more weight to like the individual possibilities and what is possible. Because so my wife, the ER physician, comes home. She talks about like bad things that happened during that day, and I would always
Yeah.
respond with like, the human body is a piece of crap, and I would be like, anything could happen at any time, and then who knows what's gonna. So I think the individual data points provide that little wrinkle.
Yeah. Right. It's something that you may never even pause to reflect on when you're just looking at the average or another summary statistic. And I know one of the things that you comment on and show some examples of are some graph types that didn't even exist or hadn't been used back with the original publication that allow for this, of being able to see the individual points. And I forget if it was a bee swarm or one of those types. I know there was an example of a few in there.
Bee swarm is one of them, showing just the individual nodes. There's unit charts are more. I don't know if they're actually called unit charts, but I call them unit charts. So it's like individual points for different categories. Way back when, there was like this stream graph that showed box office receipts over time for different movies. So, and there was like, I don't know if you remember, but there was a lot of discussion around that chart type because it was not like a traditional chart, and you can't make exact measurements based on what you see. You only get like a feel of the ebb and flow of the data. And discussions like that, I always think about when I'm analyzing data. Even in the end, after like analyzing data for so long, you don't know exactly what it is. Even in statistics, we're always like, it's possible that happened, maybe that happened, it appears that happened, but almost never we're never like that happened. So the visualization is like an extension of that. Should be an extension of analysis, where you get a feel for it, you have an idea of it, and if you want the exact numbers, then in the words of Amanda Cox, you go to a table.
So we've talked about sort of generally about some examples, and I should mention that some of these that you've brought up, how people spend a day, how you'll die, we'll make sure that we link to all of those examples in the show notes. You share a ton of examples throughout the book. Some, as we've talked about, to guide people as they're working through code you provide, so they can see what the output should look like, as well as many others, mainly from your work over the years. So I'd love to talk through a couple of these, just give people even more of a sense of what they'll find in the book. I've flagged a couple that spoke to me, but I thought first I'd ask you if you have a favorite or one you feel like talking about at the moment.
I wouldn't say there's not a specific visualization that I would focus on. I would say that, so there's one example with a bubbles that shows bubble charts. It's a scatter plot with scaled bubbles. And it takes you through the very beginning stages of making the chart, and it looks very messy and it looks very ugly. And then I take you through the steps of just making it a little more readable. And I think it's hard to read about the little things that you have to do or that you can do to make a chart more readable. And it's way more straightforward and easy to actually of making the chart. So in the example, I try to just show you the little things that I do along the way and how it could make a difference and make it less
The
garmy.
refining, right, that happens.
Yeah, because I think when I was at the very beginning when I was learning, it was like even though I read all those design tips, I just didn't know how to actually carry it through until I actually did it, and I just had to like do it a lot.
And I think that's the case with most people, right? Because it's the practicing, it's figuring out what you can do with your tools or where you're going to run into constraints and what you might do then or what other tool you turn to. And I know you work in a lot of different tools, which is great because then you're only constrained by your curiosity, I guess, at that point. I flagged a couple of examples that I want to talk through. And I know we're talking about visuals in an audio podcast, but we can describe a little bit of what we're looking at. So the first one is on page 113, and it's titled Bank Failures in the United States Since 2008. And so you have a nice subtitle there that draws attention to Silicon Valley Bank. But it spoke to me because there are a couple big circles on here that represent large bank failures and a lot of small ones. And the general layout, you've got months going across the bottom from left to right, and then years starting in 2008 and building upwards on the y-axis. And then the circles or the half circles must be sized by the monetary dollar value of the failure or something similar to that. Is this a horizon graph or does this one have another name?
I don't have a name for it. It was based on Kevin Qualey's chart on natural disasters.
It looks really cool. And the timing or the way the time is laid out, maybe you played with that over the course of it, but it makes total sense, but isn't maybe naturally where you would start. I'll say one of the reasons this spoke to me is because the other massive circle on there, I mentioned Silicon Valley Bank, but my first job out of college was at Washington Mutual Bank working in credit risk management. So I got out of there in 2007, was when I left and went to Google, which you can see was really good timing.
It's perfect timing.
Yeah. So a graph like this, what tools would you use? What would your process look like once you've analyzed it and you know what you want to do? How do you bring it from there in terms of tools and process to a final version like what we see in the book?
So assuming I already had the data, I brought it into R, and the chart shows semicircles. I used full circles at first, and it was probably in a grid format. And then I remember Kevin Qualey's chart showing natural disasters, which was semicircles and makes it less cluttered because the circles don't extend and cover like all the space. So you can see things over time. And basically in R, I made a semicircle that was very rough. So I'll describe it. So we have a chart that has yellow semicircles, and there are a bunch of labels everywhere for like the most significant bank failures of each year. And so the chart itself, the raw output would be a bubble chart that just was like black outlines, and I'm just like, it would be a rough thing that was looking for the weird stuff or the interesting stuff. And then so once I have that, and especially when I made this, it was when Silicon Valley Bank shut down. And so I wanted to highlight that and then show the scale of that. So I would go pull up the exported chart from R, which is a PDF file, and bring it into Adobe Illustrator, and then start to highlight the things that I thought was most interesting, which was at the time Silicon Valley Bank, and there were more after that, and then highlighting the scale of it, how this compares to others. So I wanted to show things that were as big or much smaller. At the time, I didn't know, but Washington Mutual Bank stands out. So I wanted to highlight that. And I would change the label size to make certain things more obvious. So like in 2020, there's First State Bank, which faltered, but it's relatively very small. So like I changed the label sizes for the smaller banks into smaller font sizes, and for more significant ones and the ones that are more interest, then change the font size to make it much larger. So that it's more obvious in what you want to look at. And then once you see those, be able to look at more of the details. And then after that, I saw that there was issues with sorting. Like the big bubbles would overshadow the small ones. So larger semicircles went to the back, and then the smaller ones came to the front so that you could see all of it, or at least get some kind of idea that there were smaller ones. And then that kind of worked, and then changed the transparency so that you could see through the smaller ones, so the bigger ones would appear. And then after that, it's about like theming and trying to make it match the aesthetic of the things that I do on FlowingData. So there's change the typeface, put in the source, put in a title, and a descriptive sentence about what the chart is about. And that's the final, I think.
I love it. I love hearing about the process because I think too many people look at a final product like this and assume that you just went straight from the data to this. But you can hear all of the decisions that are made along the way when you're like, I'm going to try this. No, that doesn't work. So now I'm going to do this. Okay, it kind of works, but now we need to add transparency or cut the circle in half. And it is this iterative process in the same way that exploring data is an iterative process. So it's neat to get insight into some of that.
Especially with Illustrator, it's really hard to describe in words. It's another one of those things where you really have to do it. But once you do it, it seems intimidating at first, but then you get a sense of it. It becomes more natural, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and everything you describe in the book is cumbersome and feels hard the first time through, but then with practice gets easier and faster, and yeah, eventually you can just develop a tool set that is as comfortable as typing or as writing something down, which is then a fun place to be. All right, I want to look at another example that spoke to me as I was flipping through. This one's on page 179. It doesn't have a prominent title, but it starts off with the legend, because this is a series of, I guess you'd call this sort of small multiples that look a little like a slope graph, but they're maybe not exactly a slope graph or a spin on slope graphs, because the slope of the main line, which actually isn't even shown on some of these, it's just the points on either side of the y-axis, plots the median, and then there's a shaded region plotting the 25th percentile and 75th percentile, where the y-axis is minutes in a day. And on the left, we see what it is for a given activity for those who do not have kids under 18 in their household, compared to on the right, where they do have kids under 18 in the household. And the activities span things like relaxing, thinking, taking a class, phone calls, playing games, phone calls with friends, listening to the radio. And as you might imagine, across every single one of those, the band of 25th to 75th percentile starts out really wide, and then it decreases across the board, it looks like, for those who have kids. What led you to make this, and what did that process look like?
I was really tired because I have kids.
Yep.
That's what brought it on. Especially, I think I made this. It was around when people were isolating, so it was even a little more tiring. So it's American Time Use Survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this was one of the data sets that, out of necessity, I had to show like a range of possibilities, because it shows the median time use of, say, the time that you relax, and then when you had no kids, and the median time that people with kids relax. So for a lot of activities, the median is just 0, or the median doesn't change that much, because the part that does change are like the distribution spreads out, or becomes more narrow. And so it shows the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile, which forms the band. And then the middle is the median. So you can still see the median. And so I think with this, I started with still a very traditional chart. I almost always start with histograms. It's my favorite chart type. It shows distributions. So I know that histograms are harder to understand for a general audience, because you have to have knowledge of what distribution is. And so in my experience, people see a histogram and want to think that the x-axis is over time. So it's like a bar chart over time instead of a histogram. Whereas the horizontal axis is the value axis. Anyways, so I made histograms for every single activity of which there are several hundred classified by the American Time Use Survey. And then, so the main question was, how has time changed for people with and without kids? And so I used that question to filter down, get to focus on the activities that changed a lot and not so much the ones that kind of stayed the same. And then after that, then I want to know which ones declined and which ones grew. So like you lose time somewhere, where did that time go? And so in this case, parents have less relaxation time, of course, but they have more time spending time with kids, which can be rewarding. You get to read to them, hang out with them, play video games sometimes, things like that. But then there's like the household chores that happen too, where you're fixing food for the kids, fixing food for the family,
Cleaning
picking them
after
up,
the
driving them
kids.
places, yeah, cleaning, helping with homework, things like that. So I wanted to get those two sides and how those fit together.
I love it. Like I said, it speaks to me as you see time shift between not having kids and having it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this stems from like all my other previous analysis on time use. So again, is like the simulation with 1,000 people is like just the whole population. And so then you can see this I made several years later, which was like looking at certain groups and all of it at the same time. So there's like merits to both.
And how does that work, right? So you've analyzed a data set once and you go back to it. I know you've said that your curiosities drive a lot of the analyses that you do and what you decide to look into in the first place. And with a data set like that, so you do something with it, do you set it aside and just wait for another curiosity to come up that causes you to go back to it? Or do you keep a list and look at that when you need an idea for a new project? Or what does your creative part of the process look like? And how do you keep track of all of the ideas and the data?
I have a long list of every single question that pops up. If it pops up, I have to write it down. I'm going to forget about it 5 minutes later. I have a terrible memory, so ever since I was a kid.
Is your list on paper or do you have any?
I used to carry around like a notepad in my back pocket, but it wore out real fast when I sat down. So I use Remember the Milk as a to-do list, but I have like a separate list for every single question. So it's probably hundreds of items long, and a lot of the stuff I don't get to, and usually, so I said earlier that a lot of charts I do happen in a series, so it's like almost a natural progression in the analysis. But then, time passes and I want to come back to it. So there's new data or the data source is gone. So like I have to figure out a different way to see it or a different way to answer the question. So I have that list, and that list is very important to me. And hopefully by the time I don't do data, I mean, I have the list of questions. That's like the driving point again. And I always have that list of questions to go to, and then maybe there's a data set and maybe there's not. A lot of the time I cannot find a data set to answer the question, which is why the list is hundreds of items long, because I have not found the data set yet.
And then do you change the question, or are there ever times where you can get the data, like make the data set? I imagine sometimes, right, if it's a personal question.
Yeah, the data will change. If the questions might change, but I'll keep the original question. So I'll answer a new question, but keep that old question because that's still there in my mind, making my brain itchy. And so I need to scratch that itch. And I might just read something, or someone brings up a new data set and I realize that I can answer the old question now. And so I have that list to refer back to, and I can mark it as complete.
I want to shift gears so we'll talk a little bit more and then move towards wrap up. But the writing process, because your life, I imagine, and we've seen a little bit through this latest visualization and the curiosity that led to it, but looks different now than it did in 2011 when you published the first edition. I also loved being able to see that progression through your dedication, first to your loving wife, and now this time around, there are a couple of new names added. Also, then you were working on finishing your PhD, I think, and now that's in the past. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that, whether your writing process looks different, how it looks different at, let's say, a different life stage than the first time around.
I would say Well, okay. So I had kids, and that deeply changes your perspective on everything that you do. I was not prepared for that before I had kids, but it changes like what you value, what you think is important, and what you want to do, and how you take care of things. So my wife was working a lot as a resident, and I was by myself in an office with my cat. I also like never wrote a book, never wrote anything that detailed other than flowing data. And so visualize this, the first edition was an extension of flowing data in 2010. And in 2010, I was much younger with very few responsibilities, and I was less serious back then, I guess. And so um, the first the first edition is very conversational. The second edition is probably less conversational, but more coherent because I also speak differently, I write differently just from writing and talking and being alive for for longer. And I would say writing the first edition was also very intimidating to me because I just didn't know what to do or how to go about it. Like I didn't even write my dissertation yet. So like this is my first big body of writing. And I also was relatively new to visualization. Like I was still learning. I had only been doing it for a few years, and I got lucky that flowing data caught on at that time. And so the first edition is very much like the result of what I was and who I was in 2010 and how I did things. And then I made charts and looked at so much more data over time and had so many more experiences that the second edition is sort of like my thoughts were more clear, and I've been doing it for so much longer. And I have a much better idea of what I want to do when I have a data set and how I'm going to get to that finished part and what I'm going to do.
And for the actual writing, did you have a specific routine that you followed for fitting it in with all of the other demands on your time, or what did that look like?
So again, it goes back to my wife being the ER physician with a very weird schedule. And then there's the kids' responsibilities. And so I write and work in between like school and all those other times. And so my wife's schedule is like very irregular at night and during the day and different times. The process was I had to get this amount done by by this date, and I knew the deadlines and I knew what had to be done by a certain time, which I'm kind of familiar with now because flowing data became my full-time job. So I have deadlines of when I have to write newsletters, of when I have to write tutorials, analyze data, publish charts, things like I have like a regular flow and schedule in between that, or like a couple of days in the week where I is much more flexible. And so writing the book was like squeezed very deeply into those 2 days. And then if I had free time and other times, then I would
And
do
just
more
backing up on
effectively.
flowing data, because I mentioned this in the intro, but do you still post daily?
It's like out of habit now. I can't stop it. It's like it's really fun for me. So I if it wasn't my job, I would still do it, I think.
Well, I'm pretty cool that it gets to be your job, right? I imagine as you were, again, going back to 2010, looking forward, would you have imagined that this is what your world would look like work-wise?
No. So when I was getting close to graduation, I did have to decide my future. In the back of my mind, I was like, if I can make flowing data work, I want to stick with that because I enjoy every single aspect of flowing data. Like even the administration side is fun for me. I don't just like every single thing is fun. So it's like it's a dream job, honestly, and I'm really lucky to have it. But I also knew that it might be beneficial to have a regular income from a company. So I took interviews, tech companies, but it was always like a competition in my mind between that company and what they provide and what the freedom that I got from doing flowing data. And so like after the string of interviews, I was like, I have to do flowing data full time. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then I'll go back. But
Super amazing when you reflect back on the amount that's gone into that, right, over that amount of time and the number of people that you reach and inspire and teach. So you should be extremely proud of what you've built.
it's fun. It's fun. So I'll keep doing it as long as it's fun.
Do you have any final words to share with me or with folks listening today?
check out FlowingData if you haven't, but you're listening to this podcast, so you probably already know what FlowingData is about. Keep having fun with data, pretty much. Enjoy it, and it doesn't have to be a chore. It could be entertaining. And I will say, visualization-wise, my goal, like many years from now when I retire, is that visualization doesn't look anything like it does now. I hope people have found a lot of more creative ways to show data, and it's like more fun, because like right when I started, started going the other way, where it was like narrowing down to different charts, different methods, and like you have to do that. Over the years, it seems like it's expanded to what it can be used, and so I hope people will keep that spirit going and try not to converge to a very specific visualization type.
Fantastic. Nathan, thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, and congratulations again on the 2nd edition of Visualize This.
Thanks a lot for having me.
To those listening, be sure to purchase your copy of Visualize This, the FlowingData Guide to Design, Visualization, and Statistics, 2nd edition, from Amazon or your favorite bookseller, and check out more of Nathan's work at flowingdata.com. Thanks very much for tuning in.